To be looking at the reasons we believe that Jesus really is raised from the dead. Because that is a very important concept for Christians. And we need to be able to explain to people why we really believe this. There are many of you here who have never heard this lesson. Some of you have heard it a long time ago. Maybe you've forgotten some of the things that we've shared. But I'd like to share this with you so that you will be able to help someone else who wants to know, really, is Jesus God's Son? Really? Did He raise from the dead? Really? Really? And we want to know that He really did. Today we're going to look at the historical Jesus. We're going to look not at the New Testament. We're going to look at what we can discover from history about Him. Because people say, oh, the only place that you read about Jesus is in the New Testament. Well, it's true. The only place that you can find a description of Him, talking about Him, things He said He did, is in the New Testament. But that's not the only place we hear about Him. Amen. We can hear about Him from history. Christianity is historical. It's not philosophical. It's not just an ethical system. Christianity is not those things. It is a historical religion. And Christianity is belief in Jesus as the Son of God. It really is. He's a real person of history. He died upon a cross. He paid the price for our sin debt, was buried on the third day, was raised, and then He proved Himself by that, to be the Son of God. That was what He did to prove it. He had told them at least 2 times in Scripture, and probably more than that. When He didn't, we don't have it written. But He told them, when they asked Him, give us a sign, tell us something. He said, as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the bowels of the fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the bowels of the earth. That's your proof. Then they came to Him when He came to clear the people out of the temple that were selling animals there and trading money with people and cheating them. And He said, how dare you turn my Father's house into a den of thieves? And they said, what do you have to give us that proves that you have the right to say this? This is your Father's house. He said, destroy this temple and in 3 days I'll raise it. Talking about the temple of His body. When He was raised from the dead, those people in Jerusalem who had clamored for His death were listening to Peter and the other disciples as they were sharing what they were sharing with them through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. And Peter answering those people when they said, what shall we do about this? They had crucified the Son of God. And He told them that. He laid it right in their laps. And He said, God raised Him from the dead, and we're here as proof of that. And those people said, what do we do? They were crushed in their hearts. And He told them exactly what to do. Repent and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ, by His authority, because of who He is, for the forgiveness of your sins, and you'll receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. The promise is to you, your children, and to everyone afar off. For everyone the Lord our God will call. So Jesus offered them historical proof. He said, when I am raised from the dead, then you'll know. How do we know anything that happened in the past? We weren't there. We didn't experience those things. How do we know that Mexican troops under Santa Anna launched an assault on the Alamo mission that lasted from February the 23rd to March this? How do we know that? We weren't there. We didn't experience any of that. How do we know it really happened? We know it because of historical testimony. There are people who were there who tell us about that. There were those who surrounded the events that told it completely after it was over. We have all of the evidence. We even have the Alamo down there as proof. We have all of the things that they gathered from there as proof. We have all of that historical testimony as proof. That is exactly what our New Testament is. It's a history book. It's not just a philosophy. It's not an ethical system. It's a history book. It's telling us facts that happened in history that give us reason to believe. Christianity is built on the person of Christ and His work in history. Any investigation into the genuineness of the claims of the Christian religion must begin with an investigation into the historical factuality of Jesus as a real person of history. We have to know that.
Sorry.
I have to stop a minute while you all look at that baby.
I know. True enough, true that.
The baby took all my attention. Isn't that good?
Praise God.
Amen. Yeah. We want to look at evidence from 1st and 2nd century non-Christian writers. People who aren't Christians, they aren't even Jews. They are what we call pagan writers. 5 witnesses from ancient sources which give us proof that there was a real Nazarene named Jesus. These are historical statements written by people that no one would question. No one. 5 early pagan Gentile writers. The very first one is Thallus. Look at the date. 52 AD. That's the right date of his writing. 52 AD. That's only 19 years after Jesus was crucified. He is a historian and he's writing history of Palestine. He's in Rome while he's writing. And he's a Samaritan born in Samaria, which is close to Jerusalem. He knew all of the facts that went on. He saw all of these things that happened. And he's writing now in Rome. He's in Rome. He's in about 52 AD, this Samaritan historian named Thallus, whose comments are preserved in a document written by Julius Africanus, who's a Christian chronographer. This man writes Christian chronography from beginning to end, the things that happened. He argued that the abnormal darkness that occurred during the crucifixion of Jesus was due to an eclipse of the sun. That's what Thallus said. It wasn't really a miracle. It was due to an eclipse of the sun, he says. Well, what's he taking for granted?
It was dark.
It was really dark, right? And what was the event that occurred? The crucifixion of Jesus Christ. So he tells us there really was a crucifixion of Jesus Christ. There was a real Jesus Christ, and it really was dark the day he was crucified. Now we know that. Was it an eclipse? Does an eclipse last for 3 hours? Huh? The darkness lasted for 3 hours. That's what Mark tells us. He says it was dark over the whole face of the earth for 3 hours. It was dark in Jerusalem. It was dark in Rome. That same 3 hours. That's why he's writing this. He's saying it wasn't really a miracle. It was an eclipse of the sun. But Julius Africanus says, I don't believe it could be an eclipse of the sun because it was during the Paschal full moon, and you can't have an eclipse when there's a full moon. So he just took away the statement that the man made, and he said it's false. It really was dark. And it really was a miracle that it was dark. And it really happened on Jesus' crucifixion. And it really was Jesus of Nazareth to whom it happened. We know all of that. In his 3rd book of history, Thallus calls this darkness an eclipse of the sun. Something that is totally off the wall. Julius Africanus says that Julius' argument assumes the existence of Christ as a fact, and Thallus never denied that Jesus existed. He just tried to explain away the miracle. So we have historical evidence that there really was a Jesus of Nazareth. He really was crucified, and it really was dark the day he was crucified. All of those 3 facts we know from history outside the New Testament. Then, as early as 52 AD, the circumstances accompanying the death of the Nazarene named Jesus were common knowledge in the city of Rome. Everybody in Rome knew about it. That's why he's writing the history, telling them. The next one that we're going to look at is Marabar Serapion. He's a manuscript in the British Museum preserves the text of a letter written sometime after 73 A.D. I started with 52 A.D., now we're at 73 A.D. Both of these are in the first century. This document was sent by a Syrian named Marbar Serapion to his son, whose name was Serapion. In prison at the time of the writing, the father pleads with his son to be wise by illustrating the folly of persecuting such wise men as Socrates, Pythagoras, and Christ. He puts Jesus Christ on the same plane as Pythagoras and Socrates, the greatest orators of their day, great men of history. And he puts Jesus right on the same plane with them. Notice his statement. What advantage did the Athenians gain from putting Socrates to death? What advantage did the men of Samos gain from burning Pythagoras? What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? Now what king had the Jews ever executed in their history? Any? Can you read of any in the Bible that they ever executed? No, of course not. The only king he's talking about that they executed was Jesus. Socrates didn't die for good. He lived on in the teaching of Plato. Pythagoras didn't die for good. He lived on in the statue of Hera. Nor did the wise king die for good. He lived on in the teaching which he'd given. Who's he talking about? Jesus. Doesn't say Jesus, but we know it's Jesus. He's not a Christian. He doesn't know that Jesus really lives on, that he rules over heaven and earth. He just thinks he lives on in the writings here of the New Testament, which when he's writing in 73 A.D., this is complete, all except for the last book, Revelation. All the rest of the books are written. So he's saying Jesus lived on in these teachings that we have. But Jesus really lives on. But what we know for sure from this man is that Jesus was already put on the same plane as the greatest philosophers of their day. Marbar Serapion refers to Pythagoras, to Socrates, and to the wise King Jesus. The point is that sometime after 73 A.D., by the time that Serapion was writing to his son, Jesus Christ had already gained fame and stature equal to that of men like Socrates and Pythagoras. Already. Jesus is a real person of history. Really. But let's look at another one, Cornelius Tacitus. He's probably considered the greatest historian of Rome. Tacitus was born in 52 to 54 A.D. At the age of 60, while writing of the reign of Nero in 54 to 68 A.D., he told how the Christians were made scapegoats for the great fire in Rome in 64 A.D. It had been rumored that Nero himself started the fire in order to gain glory by rebuilding the city, and it's really true, he did. The reason Caesar started the fire was to burn the ghetto that the Christians lived in. The Christians that moved there from Palestine lived in Rome. He burned it to get rid of that ghetto that they had. But the fire got out of hand and burned a bunch of Rome. And so people blamed it on him. So what's he do? What's he do? He blames it on the Christian. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. What do we learn? It really was Pontius Pilate who tried him. Tiberius Caesar was really Caesar at the time. And Jesus Christ was crucified. He tells us that. Why? Don't know. What did Jesus do? Don't know. Who was he? Don't know. All we know is he's real. He's a real person of history. He really was executed by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Note, to the pagan Titus, the name Christus was a proper name. He just considered it a proper name, a Roman name, Christus. It's really Christ. Tacitus was in a good position to learn of Christianity since he was governor of Asia in 112 AD. That's where John the writer of the Revelation went. And he was there in Ephesus, and this man was governor of that whole region in 112 AD. So he learned of Christianity there. The next one is C. Plinius Secundus. This man is Pliny the Younger, referred to most by the authors that write about him. He's governor of Bithynia, often wrote to the Emperor Trajan asking his imperial advice on how best to deal with this sect of Christians, which according to him were troubling the province. He says in one letter, he reveals information that was extracted from two Christian ladies, 118, 119, and he tortured them to death. And then he puts his report out to the Emperor Trajan. Here's what he says. They were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day. What day do you think that is? Sunday? Exactly like we do. They met before it was light because they had to hide in order to meet. And they sang an anthem to Christ as God and bound themselves by a solemn oath not to commit any wicked deed. After which it was their custom to separate and then meet again to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind, which was bread and wine. They partook of the Lord's Supper. What are we learning here from history? We learn that there really is a Jesus Christ. He really was crucified. It really was dark the day he was crucified. We learned that he was already put on a position in a place of all of the wise philosophers of his day. He was rated right up there with them. Why? Because he's real. And then we learned that he was really crucified on a Roman cross, tried by Pilate during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. We know that. Why? We don't know that. What did he do? We don't know that. What did he say? Who was he? We don't know. Where are we going to find out that information? The innocence of the matter seemed to perplex the governor sufficiently to write to the emperor about it. He wrote to the emperor a lot of times. I'm glad he did, because we have the documents. Note, so we have another testimony from an imperial appointee in the network of the Roman Empire that there was a historical Jesus. He really existed. The last one that we're going to look at is Suetonius. He's a court reporter, an analyst in the court official of the House of Hadrian during 120 AD. He wrote his life of Claudius, from which is taken his most often quoted reference. Here it is. As the Jews were making constant disturbance at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them from Rome. Claudius was emperor of Rome before Nero. And he cast all of the Jews out of Rome because he thought they were all Christians. They were making a disturbance at the instigation of Christus, Jesus Christ. So he expelled them from Rome. It's the same thing that Luke tells us in the book of Acts. This evidence, especially in the company with such an historian as Tacitus and Roman officials of the stature of Pliny and Secundus, make the historicity of Jesus of Nazareth as certain as any other outstanding fact of antiquity. He's real. Amen. But who is this guy? We don't know. When you read these things in history, you don't know anything about it. You just know these facts. Very sparse though they are, they really tell us there was a historical Jesus. He really was crucified. It really was dark the day he was crucified. And it was done by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. And he, we're going to discover from other historical sources, was raised from the dead. But we don't know why. So many Jews had become Christians at Rome. Claudius probably equated the Jews with Christians and expelled them from the city of Rome by an imperial decree. Luke, by the way, records this same event in Acts 18, 1 through 2. You can read about it there. That's why Aquila and Priscilla left, because he cast them out. Note, so here we have our 5 witnesses from pagan sources that tell us of a real historical Jesus. Men of the stature of Tacitus, Pliny, Suetonius make the historicity of Jesus an undeniable fact. Nobody can deny that there really was a Jesus. Nobody. Because we have 5 historical sources that give him credibility. Let's look at the next 2. There are 2 Jewish sources. Now the Jews hated him. So every comment that they make in their Talmud is going to be antagonistic to him. But enough to give us real reason to believe he really existed. The Talmud was written, probably finished about 200 AD. In 70 AD, when Jerusalem was destroyed by Titus, the Roman general, he came in and completely laid waste to all of Palestine, besieged the city of Jerusalem for 3 years, then destroyed it and tore down every single building, all the walls around the city and everything, tore it all down. And then sowed it with salt. He had his army go in and scatter salt over everything. And he said, nothing will ever grow here again. Of course it does now. But then he said, no, it won't. But the Talmud began being written after that because all of the Jewish documents were destroyed. They thought all of them were destroyed. They didn't know about the stuff that was down at Qumran. That those Essene Jews had put up in the caves in the top of the mountains, there above the Dead Sea, and they weren't discovered until right after World War II. But then they didn't know about any of these. And so all of their documents were destroyed. And they had to start writing everything over from memory. And all of their rabbis got together and they started talking about all of these things, and what they knew from memory, they wrote down. The Gemaras and the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the law code. The Gemaras are the commentaries on the law code. All of it makes up the Talmud. And it was finished about 200. The Talmud, from 70 AD to 200 AD, tells us many references about Jesus. We have many references in there about Christ. All of these references are hostile to the cause of Christ, but they do help to establish his existence. Here's what it says. Jesus of Nazareth was a transgressor in Israel. That's what they called him, a lawbreaker. They said, you break the law by healing on the Sabbath, by letting your disciples eat corn, take corn and scrape it off of the husk and eat it on the Sabbath. They accused him of breaking the Sabbath constantly. They accused him of falsely saying that he was the Son of God, and so they crucified him for that. But they called him a transgressor in Israel, who practiced magic. What are they talking about?
Miracles.
Magic? Our New Testament tells every single thing he did, and not a single one of them are magic. They're miracles. But they call it magic because they have to call it something. And then they say, he scorned the words of the wise. Jesus was constantly in conflict with the high priest and those Sadducees and Pharisees. Constantly they came and they asked him questions. They tried to trap him. Never, ever one single time could they trap him. So they quit even asking him questions. That's what we know as a fact. But the Talmud says he scorned the words of the wise. And he led the people astray, they say, and said he'd not come to destroy the law, but to add to it. Did he ever say he came to add to the law? No. Remember what he said?
Fulfill it.
I've not come to destroy the law. I've come to... There you go. I came to live it out completely without a mistake one. Without one single sin. That's what he said. He didn't say he was adding to it. They misquoted him there. But enough evidence there to know there's really a Jesus of Nazareth, right? Then Flavius Josephus. After Jerusalem was destroyed, he was one of the generals. There were 5 generals who commanded the army in Jerusalem when the city was under siege. At one point, they broke a hole in the back wall of the city and tried to escape with the army to try to get around and attack Rome from the front. That was after they were starved to death. But when they escaped out the back hole, the Roman army was right there and killed every single one of them. And 5 of the generals went into a cave and made a suicide pact. 4 of them died. Josephus survived. That's the only one. He was then taken into the royal family of the Flaviuses at Rome. Taken back to Rome. Well, there at Titus, the Roman general, made him his translator and had him go up and tell the people on the wall, if you surrender, we will spare every one of you. If you don't surrender, we're going to come in and destroy the city. Everyone's going to die. They didn't surrender. Everyone died. Everyone. Josephus was the only one who escaped. He was taken back to Rome, and he wrote the history of the Jews and the wars of the Jews. 2 documents. He was made a member of the house of Flavius and was given the right to write those things. The most important reference to Jesus from a Jewish source are from this general whose name is Flavius Josephus. In his writings he tells us who he was, what he did, and his own evaluation of an historian. He writes of many of the outstanding persons we read of in the New Testament, of Pilate, of Quirinius Caesar, of the Caesars of Herod, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, of Annas, Caiaphas, Felix, and Festus, all of them. He writes of all of those people that we read about in our New Testament. He also writes of Jesus' brother James and of the death of John the Baptist. Most significant is his reference to Jesus. Let's read it. Now, there are those who say that it's not real, that some Christian writer came after the fact and added it. They said that back in the 1800s at a school of philosophy in Tübingen, Germany. But after that, we have found lots more of his documents. Then we only had 1 or 2 of them. And they said they were interpolluted. But afterwards, we found other documents, and in every single document, the text is complete. Everyone. So it's not an interpollution. It's something he really wrote. He says, and there arose about this time Jesus a wise man, if indeed we should call him a man. Why do you think they say that? Because he wasn't a man. He was God. And that's what he's referring to there. For he was a doer of marvelous deeds. What are those? Miracles. He calls them marvelous deeds. They were marvelous.
Yes.
They were so marvelous that people were amazed at them. They couldn't even figure it out. It's like, what? How? And he says he's a teacher of men who received the truth with pleasure. He won over many Jews and also many Greeks. This man was the Messiah. That's what they say was an interpollution. But every single document of Josephus has that in it. This man was the Messiah. And when Pilate had condemned him to the cross at the instigation of our own leaders, those who had loved him from the first did not cease. For he appeared to them on the 3rd day alive again. You see that? As the holy prophets had predicted and said many other wonderful things about him. And even now, the race of Christians so named after him has not yet died out. Here we have a Jewish source, not a Christian. He's not a Christian. But he's writing history. And he's telling truth. He's a good historian. And he's just telling what he knew was true. What he knew was fact. He doesn't tell us what Jesus said. He doesn't tell us who he was. He doesn't tell us what kind of person he was. He just tells us the facts that he knew. But they're enough for us to have an interest, isn't it? It's enough for us to want to find, why was he put to death? What did he do? What kind of person? What were these marvelous deeds that he did? What were these magic tricks that he showed people? What was all of this? It ought to generate some interest in us because it's history. Really history. Notice, he spoke of Jesus as the so-called Christ. And he tells us about the arrest and the trial of James and speaks of him as the brother of Jesus. He speaks of Jesus as the doer of wonderful deeds, a man, he says, if indeed he can be called a man. And he states that this man was the founder of the tribe called Christians. And he's writing, Josephus speaks twice of Christ, here and another time. But this is the main one. We have 5 Gentile, pagan writers who don't care about Christianity or Judaism at all, who all claim there really was a Christ. He really was crucified. It really was dark the day he was crucified. It was done by Pontius Pilate. It was during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. And he was a wise man, equivalent with the wisest men of their day. Did any of you know the Pythagorean theorem? Do you know it, Emily? It says the hypotenuse of a right triangle is equal to the square of the sum of the square of the other 2 sides. Right? Where did we learn that? Pythagoras, the man that they equated Jesus with. We have 2 Jewish references, 5 pagan references. None of these writers were biased in their favor of the claims of Christ to be the Son of God. None of them. But as far as they were concerned, Jesus was a real historical person. A real person of history. That is an undeniable fact.
Amen.
Amen.
Now, what about the New Testament? We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew was a contemporary of Jesus. Walked with him, talked with him, lived with him 3.5 years, day and night. John was a disciple of Jesus, lived with him, talked with him, ate with him, was at the Last Supper with him. Mark was the son of Peter. And he heard of Jesus, but he reported everything his dad had said about Jesus everywhere he went. That's what the Gospel of Mark is. Actually, the sermon of the Apostle Peter, everywhere Peter went. Luke, the greatest historian ever, claimed by most people to be the best historian who's ever written. And he writes the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. Read them. You'll discover that he's a powerful writer.
Amen.
These 4 men give us in detail the life of Jesus Christ. Matthew, Mark, and John are the synoptic Gospels. They're called synoptic because they track each other. You can compare them and read the same things in each one of them. Yes, that's called synoptic.
John?
And Luke is, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the synoptic Gospels. John writes a completely different kind of gospel. He just gives 7 miracles that Christ performs. 7 signs, he says. And he says these are sufficient to prove he's the Son of God.
Amen.
The New Testament would be totally adequate to prove that Jesus was a real person in history if we didn't have all of this other stuff. It'd be enough in itself. Whatever reasons may be given for receiving the testimony of Josephus or Tacitus or of any other writer from antiquity as reliable history must be equally applied to the New Testament writers. If we listen to them and say this is really true, whatever reasons we have for listening to them, whatever reason we have for considering that they're really historical documents, when we test them and put the same test to the New Testament, we have to accept it if it passes those tests. And it does.
Amen.
All of the New Testament writers were contemporaries of Jesus. All of them. 4 were eyewitnesses. 3 accompanied Jesus throughout his ministry. And all of their writings are in remarkable agreement and continue to stand the test of genuineness and historicity. If the New Testament documents were the only source from antiquity which presented us the life of Christ, that would be more than sufficient proof of his historical reality. Altogether, from pagan sources, Jewish sources, and the New Testament itself, we conclude there was a real Jesus of history.
Amen.
He really existed. Christianity bases the whole of its teaching upon the reality of this historical Jesus.
Amen.
We, at this point, from what we've discovered today, know nothing about how he was crucified, what happened at his crucifixion, how he was buried, who buried him. We know none of that. When we read the New Testament, we discover all of that. And that's what we're going to look at next week when we look at the historical evidence of the New Testament for the resurrection of Jesus. We're going to look first at the empty tomb itself. It's a great testimony. And we're going to discover what it tells us next week. Don't miss that.
Amen.
And then the week after that, we're going to look at the grave clothes that were left. Powerful evidence. We will look at this evidence and we will conclude when we finished it, is he the Son of God?
Yeah.
And we'll be able to say without any hesitation at all, yes,
Amen.
he is. What a wonderful blessing that will be for you. You'll have reason to be able to tell people why you believe. Won't that be good?
Hey, John, just to add a credibility to this, is this is taught in a university too, at Sunset, in apologetics. So that just adds so much credibility to what you're saying too.
Absolutely. All right. We're going to have our prayer requests following the singing of 2 songs by Brother Claude. And if you have concerns on your heart that you want to present, or if you have needs that you need to present, please write them down. Nathan will be able to bring the prayer request forms to you. Write those down, and then Mark will read them and offer the prayer of thanksgiving.
Number 960, 962.
Remember all that?
Nine 6 0.